Hello everyone, my name is Sia. I'm a Samurai Shodown 2019 player from Arizona, and I've been playing the game since launch. Like many players, I'd fallen off the game around the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, but returned when rollback netcode was introduced, and, mostly, well implemented into the Steam version. This time has been spent refamiliarizing myself with the game, and seeing how much the meta has changed, and I certainly had a lot to catch up on. One of these changes was actually with my own character, Charlotte. Charlotte was kind of a beast back in Season 1. Back when Genjiro dominated the game, she was one of the few characters that could compete well against him. Nowadays, I don't think there's any top player that would consider her in the discussion of the game's strongest characters. So, what happened? Why did a previously top 5 character who, while receiving some nerfs, stayed overall the same? Well, let's talk about it. If I were to describe Charlotte's game plan, it would be this. She's a mid-screen zoner that uses her strong, low-risk pokes and specials to keep out the opponent and whittle down their health. While she's clearly a defensive character, her jumping C, low jump, and 5D help give her a solid enough offensive game and pressure the opponent up close. On paper, her kit seems pretty solid, and it is. The problem with her kit isn't what she has in a vacuum, but rather what she has compared to the top tiers and characters in a similar archetype, most of these being DLC. Today I wanted to create a matchup chart for Charlotte and break down where she does well, who she struggles against, and hopefully better explain why she fell off since Season 1. Keep in mind that all of this is my opinion. I try to get as much experience as I can, but the scene for SamSho 2019 is pretty small, so matchup theory is needed in some places. While I don't think I'm talking out of my ass with these matchups, I am happy to discuss any of them further with anyone. I'll be going through the cast in order by how they appear on the character select screen. With that out of the way, let's get started. Haohmaru is a pretty even matchup, very fundamentals heavy. I think it really comes down to the player. I think both Charlotte and Haohmaru, their kits, counter each other pretty well. Haohmaru has a pretty good fireball, even if his buttons aren't quite on the level of Charlotte's. He has a great weapon flip. His mix-up game, pretty meh. Like, his lows aren't really the scariest thing. Has a fantastic recoil game, though. But yeah, overall, very even matchup. Pretty fundamentals-based. Pretty fun, too. Nakoruru, I kind of go back and forth between even or maybe slightly unfavorable for Charlotte. Charlotte's buttons are pretty good against Nako since she is kind of stubby overall, and Nako's damage isn't very good. Nako makes up for it, though, in having a fantastic hit-and-run game against Charlotte. She's fantastic at whiff punishing with stuff like her weapon flip, Nako Car, and you can't really play a zoning game against Nakoruru. One, because of her Fireball the Bird, but also just because she has a very good Reflect. So it's kind of one I think that Charlotte needs to play more of a mid-range type of game. It can be pretty annoying, but overall pretty doable compared to other matchups. Yashimaru is a pretty annoying, but overall even matchup. I think it comes down really how well you can pin down Yashimaru. His double jump, it can be pretty annoying. I think it can be a little difficult to DP him. With that said, it's not impossible to hit him out in the air. With stuff like 66A, her jumping normals, it's definitely doable. I think where Yasha is really threatening is in rage. When he's not in range, his normals, while they're long, aren't really quite as scary just because the damage isn't quite there. When he's in rage, though, you definitely have to be more careful and much more cautious in how you approach him. The Galford matchup is pretty similar to Hanzo in quite a few ways. Just like Hanzo, I think Charlotte has much better normals across the board than Galford does. And his damage isn't quite there, which is great for Charlotte. I think it is a little worse than the Hanzo matchup because Galford can be a little more annoying since his Fireball is less for mix-ups and is a much better zoning tool. So he is much better at a hit-and-run game than Hanzo is. I think that's the major thing. Despite that hit-and-run game, I still think it is generally in Charlotte's favor. Ukiyo, I think, is a pretty even matchup. Ukiyo's normals are pretty good, but really I think what it comes down to is just how well you deal with the Tsubame mix-ups. Tsubame is where the majority of Ukyo's damage is going to come from. So if you are very good at anticipating it and just dealing with his high-low game, it's really not too bad of a matchup. Tsubame is punishable, which just makes it much more bearable. Kyoshiro, I think, is either an even matchup or maybe a bit in Charlotte's favor. Kyoshiro's flaws are still glaringly obvious, like his terrible recovery on a lot of his moves, as well as the fact that he can't never fully establish screen control because of his crouch walk. With that said, the things that Kyo is very good at, like his pretty good normals, good chip, save on block specials, those actually are very good against Charlotte. I do think he also has pretty good anti-airs against Charlotte. Surprisingly very good anti-airs. If he whiffs it, that's a very good punish for Charlotte, but overall, I think he has actually quite a few pretty good tools to compete with her. Alright, Jubei. I think that's a pretty even matchup, very fundamentals heavy. I think Jubei and Charlotte do have a pretty similar game plan. I think Jubei generally gets more damage off of his pokes, more reward, but Charlotte, I think, has a larger toolkit to work with, which is great for her. She has a DP, better weapon flip, but ultimately I think they both counter each other pretty well. Tam is a matchup that I used to really hate a lot as Charlotte. Nowadays, I think it can be annoying, but I really don't think it's that bad anymore. I would lean more towards it being even. Tam is great at outzoning Charlotte, so her fireball game is very limited. You really have to move in against Tam. You can't rush in. With that said, walking and blocking, I think going with a strategy like that, the matchup is pretty doable. Definitely, it's one that requires a lot of patience on your part, though. Hanzo, I think, is a pretty good matchup for Charlotte. It's arguably her best matchup, actually. Charlotte, just her normals across the board are much better than Hanzo's. She's super good at walling out against him. He is very reliant on mix-ups in order to get good damage in, and if you can really prevent that, there's really not much that Hanzo is able to do. And on top of that, some of his mix-ups are even punishable, so the risk-reward is vastly in Charlotte's favor. His mobility is pretty annoying. It's very good, so if he does happen to get a life lead, it can be very hard to catch up with him, but otherwise, I'm really never worried if I'm fighting Hanzo. Genjiro, I think, is more an even matchup. I could see the argument for it being a bit in Charlotte's favor. This is actually a rare matchup where I think Charlotte's Fireball actually wins the Fireball war. Her normals are pretty good against Genjiro. I think the thing that I do have a bit of trouble with, admittedly, that I do think Genjiro's mix-up game is very good, especially from his Rekkas. I know there is that counterblade to it, but I do think it's actually very solid overall, and he does have a fantastic DP as well. I just think those things really help balance out the matchup and make it more even. Earthquake is another character that I used to really hate. Nowadays, I think it can be pretty annoying, but I do consider it only an even matchup for Charlotte. His zoning with his normals is, of course, very good. And Charlotte definitely has a more annoying time than other characters because she has a slower run. With that said, I think when she manages to get in, Earthquake is such a massive target. His close range options are so limited. And as long as she manages to kind of stay there, it's really not that bad of a matchup in my opinion. Now, Shiki, I'm surprised actually to see varying opinions on Shiki. I think there's some that consider it a pretty good matchup for Shiki, but I actually think Charlotte slightly wins this one. I understand why they say that. Shiki, because of her SSM, she can punish fireballs on a reaction, so Charlotte's zoning game is very limited against Shiki. With that said, I don't actually think Charlotte needs to rely on it that much, just because Charlotte, I think, has much better buttons than Shiki. She can hold her own on the ground very well. She can catch Shiki in the air pretty fine, just because Shiki's air normals are pretty mediocre. So overall, that's kind of how the matchup goes. I'm really not too afraid of fighting Shiki, despite not having much of a zoning game against her. Yoshitora, I think, is another even matchup. I think Charlotte is pretty good at keeping out Yoshitora as long as you're on point. She does have a good TP to deal with Jumping C, Really, I think the entire matchup comes down to how well you're dealing with jumping C, because if you aren't really good at DPing or stance breaking, the Yoshitora is going to overwhelm you pretty well. But if you are able to shut that down, the rest of his options overall are kind of just okay. Darlie, I think, is a very good matchup for Charlotte. I think it's relatively easy to keep out Darlie compared to a lot of other characters. Darlie really needs a good read in order to get in. Charlotte's normals are just good at walling her out. She's pretty easy to anti-air, even with how low her jump arc is. With that said, you really need to be on point when it comes to keeping her out, because one mistake and Darlie really gets some massive damage in. So definitely don't slack off against her. Wu, I think, is actually a pretty even matchup for Charlotte despite her low tier status. I think Wu's zoning actually does give Charlotte a lot of trouble. Charlotte does have a hard time kind of moving around it. She can't really play the fireball game against her. But on the other hand, Charlotte's normals are much better than Wu's, and I think that actually balances the matchup out pretty well as long as Charlotte manages to get in. Rimu can be kind of annoying if you don't really know how to fight her, but when you do, I actually do think it's a pretty good matchup for Charlotte. The typical zoning gameplay doesn't really work against Rimuru. You really do need to kind of go in and be more aggressive. Unlike a lot of other characters, though, it actually isn't that bad for Charlotte, her doing that. And Charlotte, since she has a DP, she is kind of blessed with having a really solid, consistent option against the ice platforms. So that's really all there is to it. You definitely need to play differently against Rimu, but it's actually pretty doable and pretty advantageous for Charlotte when you know what you're doing. Basara, I think, is even, or maybe a bit in Charlotte's favor. The important thing to really know is just how fake or reactable a lot of his mix-ups and set play are. And just as you learn to fight him, you kind of really start to see just how much risk a lot of his moves carry. A lot of his really more rewarding stuff when compared to the rest of the cast. With that said, I do think he has some pretty good normals against Charlotte. Pretty long range that are pretty good at keeping her out if he does manage to have that life lead, which can be pretty annoying. But with that said, I don't think Charlotte particularly struggles to move in against him, as long as you're smart about it. Kazuki, I think, is slightly unfavorable for Charlotte. He already is a pretty good anti-zoner, but I think he also has surprisingly good zoning tools just with how good his fireball is. And of course, his damage potential is amazing. He has probably some of the best damage in the game. Where I think Charlotte has a pretty good advantage, though, is in her normals. Kazuki is a pretty stubby character in general, so I think that helps to balance out the matchup a bit. But overall, Kazuki's damage and his anti-zoning capabilities really, I think, help give him a pretty good advantage against Charlotte. The matchup against Wanfu really just comes down to how you deal with Pillar Toss. It's easily his strongest tool. He can cross you up with it, so he does have that bit of mix with it. It can be pretty confusing, but really outside of Pillar Toss, I don't really think Wanfu is that threatening for Charlotte. He's pretty easy to keep poking out. If he manages to screw up his Pillar Toss and now he's out, he no longer has his weapon, Charlotte, I think, just has complete advantage in that situation. He's just a very limited character, I think, outside of his Pillar Toss. So overall, I think it's pretty good for Charlotte. Shizumaru, I do think, is an unfavorable matchup. On the ground, I think Charlotte does pretty okay, but Shizu is arguably the best character in the air. His air mobility and options in the air are just so good. His mix-ups are fantastic. And on top of all that, just his toolkit in general is just so massive. He really is able to deal with a lot of Charlotte's kit fine. Like, at worst, he can keep up with her pretty well. And at best, he can punish things like her zoning, since he can punish it from full screen. Mina, I think, is a pretty unfavorable matchup for Charlotte. She's an incredibly strong zoner, so Charlotte really struggles to get in against her, and Mina can really outzone Charlotte as well. Mina isn't the most damaging character, but she is super good at just, I think, locking out Charlotte's options, so you really need to capitalize on strong reads in order to beat her, I think. Sogetsu, I think, is maybe slightly unfavorable for Charlotte. Uh, I think both characters are very good at sitting on a life lead, and the other character really is going to struggle to catch up if there's a significant enough life lead. I just think it's maybe harder when Sogetsu really gets his set play going and has that life lead. I think it's much harder for Charlotte to catch up to him. Bubble, while it's unsafe, just when Sogetsu gets that looping set play going, I think it's very hard for Charlotte to get out of it. Iroha, I think, is a pretty bad matchup for Charlotte. Even though Iroha's neutral because she doesn't have a run, is a lot more limited. She does have a pretty strong zoning game and hit and run game. Uh, she's great at running away from Charlotte. Her air game, very good. It's going to be hard for Charlotte to kind of anti-air her. So it's a lot of Charlotte really trying to catch up to her, and that can be pretty annoying. The Warden matchup, I think, is pretty simple to explain in terms of game plan. Warden, overall, is just a pretty simple character in general. He's actually kind of similar to Charlotte in a lot of ways. He can compete pretty well with her in terms of normals. Where I think the matchup kind of more gears towards Charlotte's favor is the fact that his options outside of his fantastic normals are very limited. If you can really stop his jumping, his air game, and just using jumping B and C a lot, he could be pretty easy to deal with overall. I think on the ground, Charlotte has the advantage for sure. Gongsun Lee, I think, is a pretty unfavorable matchup for Charlotte. What she lacks in damage, she makes up for by just being incredibly hard to pin down. I don't think there's any character more difficult for Charlotte to catch up to. One particular part of the matchup that I think is pretty annoying is that if you're going to convert into weapon flip, it has to be for damage. Since GSL really doesn't care about being unarmed. She's going to be unarmed for half the match anyway. So things like throw into weapon flip, which would normally be a fantastic tool to gain the momentum in a match, really doesn't matter against her. So if you want to go into weapon flip, make sure it's for damage. Overall, while Charlotte has, I think, maybe better damage than GSL, she's just so good at running away that it generally is going to stay an uphill battle. Champ can definitely be annoying to fight, but I do think it's a pretty good matchup for Charlotte overall. As you just fight her more, you start to realize just how punishable her kit is, or otherwise how fake a lot of her mix-ups are. So once you really start to shut down more and more of her options, she actually becomes a very limited character against Charlotte. Just within that mid to close range, I think is that ideal spot to be in against her. And when you're there really isn't much that Champ can really do. Fighting Hibiki is a lot like fighting another Charlotte that traded her DP for a better everything else. Hibiki follows a pretty similar game plan to Charlotte, but generally is just much stronger, much more threatening. Her normals are extremely threatening. Her damage is much, much better than Charlotte's, and her ability to convert off the damage is fantastic. Her weapon flip is some of the best in the game. Really, the only thing I would say that Charlotte has over Hibiki is just her anti-air game. Hibiki's anti-air game is pretty mediocre, but otherwise, it is a pretty uphill battle whenever you're fighting Hibiki. Amakusa is, without a doubt in my mind, Charlotte's worst matchup. I do, no exaggeration, I think this matchup is terrible for her, to the point where I don't even really want to run the matchup as Charlotte if I ever run into an Amakusa bracket. His fireball is great already for zoning, and Charlotte has a hard time jumping over it just because of the size of it and her jump arc. He can cover himself in the air pretty well, despite how floaty his jump is, so Charlotte has a hard time anti-airing him. He has a teleport for running away. His mix-up game is fantastic. And his normals just keep out Charlotte, I think, very well. It's just an uphill battle, I think, in almost every conceivable way, and it's not a matchup I enjoy at all. I wish I had some more positive things to say, but you really have to be super on point to play this matchup well. Alright, Baiken. Yeah, this matchup is pretty rough for Charlotte. I think it's one of her worst. Baiken's buttons are just fantastic. Generally, they outrange Charlotte. They're very oppressive, very fast, and most are non-deflectable too. Her best normals aren't. She generally just gets way more reward off her buttons than Charlotte does. While some of Baikon's buttons are punishable, the best that Charlotte is usually going to get is just a light if they're spaced well. So it's really just a very uphill battle. This matchup, you really just need strong reads and knowing what's the best punish for the situation. A lot of situational awareness to deal with Baiken well. Now, with all of this, do I think Charlotte is a bad character? No, far from it actually. I think she's overall a very solid character, and her kit still naturally plays Samurai Shodown very well. I feel comfortable using her. I don't see myself playing anybody else in this game, at least maining, because I do have a few other characters I play. But as you can probably see from the chart, her main problem, I think, came down to power creep. The DLC just gave us zoners that really were able to play a much more oppressive zoning game plan than she can, and were able to overall outdamage her or otherwise be able to completely control the screen better than she can. So when you compare Charlotte to them, I don't like to use the word honest, but she is pretty basic in comparison. When you compare her to pretty much any of the other major zoners in the game, the main thing that Charlotte has over them is a DP and the fact that it's invincible, which admittedly is very nice to have, but I think pretty much any player is going to prefer having massive damage over an invincible reversal every single time in this game. So that's really what it comes down to. I do think she has what it takes to play the game well, and I think anybody that's interested in playing Charlotte will have a pretty good time. I think she's a very fun character to play, even with how basic she is. It just fits how I like to play. So if you're interested, absolutely give her a shot. And there you have it. That is my matchup chart for Charlotte. I hope you enjoyed the video. I've never done anything like this before, so it's pretty exciting for me. As I've said, I love the character and I love this game, so I'm always happy to put out content to help spread the word about it. If you've never played SamSho, or maybe played it in the past and had thoughts about returning, definitely give it a try. The game is incredible, and there's really nothing like it in the modern fighting game landscape. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see ya next time.